Your husband's been here a week. No one signed the authorization. The nurse's voice was calm, but it cut through me like a broken blade. He's unconscious. Organ failure's progressing. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vasquez, but without consent we can only do so much. I stared at Thomas, my husband. Wires ran down his arms like vines. Machines blinked where his voice used to be. His skin had the gray tone of a man no longer held by the world. And I wasn't supposed to be here. Who signed him in? I asked, my voice hoarse. Your son! Elliot Vasquez. He dropped off the paperwork, then left for a wellness retreat in Palm Springs. My chest clenched. He left. He left his dying father to rot in this hospital. While he sipped green juice and meditated, I gripped the bedrail. My nails dug into the metal. Something inside me cracked, but not loudly. Not the kind of crack that breaks, the kind that sharpens. I hadn't seen Thomas in 6 years. Not since I packed my bags in the middle of a California spring and drove east toward New Mexico. Back then, Elliot stood in the driveway. He didn't hug me. He didn't cry. He said, "You're making things worse, Mom. Just go." And I did. Until last week, when an envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Just one line typed in bold. Thomas Vasquez is currently in critical condition at Santa Barbara General Hospital. I booked the next flight. I didn't call first. Didn't ask permission. Didn't even pack my good shoes. I landed at dawn, took a cab straight to the house we built together, brick by brick. The place where I raised Elliot, watched Thomas grade papers by the fireplace, folded laundry while the kettle whistled. But the house didn't remember me. The front door groaned open. The air inside was stale, like no one had breathed in it for weeks. I walked past the old piano. Dust lay thick on the keys. Photos still hung, crooked and untouched. The couch had an indent, like someone had sat too long without moving. My stomach turned. Something was wrong. Then the phone rang. The landline, not my cell. The one still bolted to the kitchen wall, yellowed and silent for years. I picked it up, hand trembling. "Mrs. Vasquez, I see you. Please come immediately." Now here I was, back in his room, back in the middle of the betrayal. Elliot had power of attorney. I knew that. Thomas gave it to him the year I left. Said it made sense. Said Elliot was stable enough to abandon his father to a slow death. I sat beside the bed. Thomas didn't stir. I reached for his hand. His fingers were cold, but not gone. He had been alone. All this time, I opened the drawer beside him. Old glasses, a folded napkin, a list, his handwriting shaky but clear. Call Lenora, that was all. They never did. They never called. I was his wife for 44 years, but I hadn't mattered. Until now, the beeping was steady. Too steady. It wasn't a rhythm you could dance to. Not like the old music Thomas used to play on Sunday mornings. Light jazz and brass, drifting out of our kitchen radio. I leaned back in the chair beside his bed. The vinyl creaked. My knees ached, but I didn't move. He looked so still, like the man I'd married had gone somewhere far. And I wasn't sure he'd find his way back. We met in 1974. I was 19, straight out of nursing school. He was the visiting guest lecturer on trauma ethics. I made fun of his corduroy jacket. He said it had survived 2 presidents and a protest. He left a note in my coat pocket before his train left that week. "You're the first person to make me laugh and challenge me in the same breath. Don't disappear." I never did. We got married a year later in a tiny chapel on the outskirts of Santa Barbara. I wore a borrowed veil. His best friend sang off-key. We were poor, stubborn, and stupid in love. Our first apartment had a leaky ceiling. I cooked with one pan and a dented kettle. He graded papers on the floor, back against the heater, fingers stained with red ink. But every night, without fail, he left a note beside my pillow. Just one line. "Hun?" Sometimes funny, sometimes wise, sometimes tired. Today was chaos. "But your lasagna saved me? You snored so loud last night the cat slept in the bathroom. I love you, and that's all I'll ever need?" I blinked back to the present. The ICU light flickered faintly above us. The air smelled of antiseptic copper and artificial lemon. I reached for the blanket, pulled it up gently under his chin. "You always hated being cold," I whispered. My voice echoed barely, his mouth parted slightly. His skin sagged where strength once lived. He had always been lean, but now he was frail. Elliot had called him stubborn, said he refused checkups. said it wasn't his job to babysit a man who didn't listen. But Elliot never saw the nights Thomas sat up reading medical journals after I retired. How he worried in silence. How he would squeeze my hand when he thought I wasn't looking. "It's funny," I murmured. "You outlived your students, but not your habits." He didn't answer. Only the monitors replied. Our last real fight was 6 years ago. Elliot wanted us to invest in some tech startup. Said it was revolutionary. Thomas was tempted, I wasn't. I told him we didn't need more risk. We needed more time. He said I was afraid of change. I said he was afraid of growing old. I left that night. Packed just enough. Slammed the car door a little harder than I meant. I didn't expect him to let me go, but he did. And the silence between us grew thicker than any walls we'd ever lived within. Now, in the quiet hum of this sterile room, I wanted so badly to go back. Not to change everything. Just to fix one goodbye. I reached for the drawer again. There were his glasses, scratched and fogged. A small notebook, mostly empty. And beneath that, wrapped in an old napkin, I found it. His pocket watch. I hadn't seen it in years. It was a gift from his father. Worn brass, initials engraved beneath the hinge. He used to wend it every night, like a ritual. Said it helped him think. Said time should never be left to chance. I held it to my ear. It still ticked faint, slow, but alive. My hand tightened around the watch. I looked at him, and for the first time in years, I whispered, "I'm here, Thomas." I came back. His eyelids didn't flutter. His chest didn't rise. But a tear gathered near the corner of his eye. Barely visible, but there. Or maybe it was mine. Either way, I didn't move. I stayed. The phone rang just after sunrise. It wasn't the hospital. It was him. "Elliot." I stared at the screen. My thumb hovered over the green button. Then I answered. "Mom." He said it like a question, like even the word didn't fit his mouth anymore. "I heard you showed up." At the hospital, his tone was clipped, polished, emotionless. "Corporate." "Yes," I said slowly. "I'm sitting next to your father now. Look, I don't know why you decided to fly in after all this time, but things are under control." I looked at Thomas, who hadn't moved in hours. Machines breathed for him. Nurses changed his bedding like he was a name on a chart. Under control. "Elliot," I said, choosing each word like a step through broken glass. "Your father is dying?" "I know that." He snapped. "We all knew it would happen eventually. You think I haven't tried to manage everything alone." My hand gripped the edge of the bedside table. "Then why did you leave? Why are you at a resort while he's here? Like this?" He sighed. Loud, performative. "Because I needed space. You think it's easy making decisions when no one helps? You never asked. You left," he said sharply. "Years ago. You made your choice." Silence burned between us. I could hear the soft chatter of birds on his end. Wind, palm trees. "Luxury? You haven't even signed the medical authorization," I said. "They can't treat him properly. I'll get to it." "When? After he's gone?" He didn't answer. I could picture him, white robe, fresh juice, legs crossed by a pool, a man in control of nothing. "This isn't about me," I said. He snapped. "You think barging back into our lives after 6 years is noble. You abandoned him? I left because you pushed me out." "We didn't push, you walked." I closed my eyes. The words stung even now. "I walked because you looked me in the eye and said I didn't belong anymore." "Because you didn't." There it was. Unfiltered. He said it like reading a calendar note. Like saying, "Take out the trash. You're not part of this family anymore, Mother." He'd said that 6 years ago. And he still meant it. I could hear it in his voice. I sat at the kitchen table in Thomas's house. Same chair I once used for Thanksgiving dinners, late night charting, reading Eliot's college essays. The table was dusty now. A ring of dried coffee marked the wood. The fridge hummed, mostly empty. Nothing here felt lived in. Just maintained. Like Eliot had kept it running because it looked good on paper. But the soul was gone. I remembered standing in this same kitchen 6 years ago. Suitcase by my side. Eliot had come in, jacket on, keys in hand. "Leaving again? You told me to?" He shrugged. "If you can't handle being a support, then maybe it's best. I took care of your father while you were busy building your image." "I didn't ask you to." That was his favorite phrase. I didn't ask. He didn't have to. I did it anyway. Because I was a wife. Because I was his mother. Because that's what love does. It doesn't need permission to show up. Why now? Elliot asked over the phone, pulling me back to the present. His voice was lower. I couldn't tell if he was tired or bored. Because I got a letter, and because no one else seemed to care. Maybe because we all moved on. That's a lie, Elliot. You didn't move on. You just replaced things. He laughed, short, hollow. You sound just like you used to. Overdramatic, guilt-tripping, always making it about feelings. Someone had to. His tone sharpened. I have to go. I'll deal with the paperwork. Don't do anything impulsive. He hung up. Not goodbye, just gone. I sat in silence for several minutes. Then I stood. I went to the living room and picked up the photo from the mantel. The last one we ever took as a family. It was Christmas. Thomas had just recovered from pneumonia. I had made pot roast. Elliot brought a woman I barely knew. In the photo, Thomas smiled weakly. I stood beside him, hands on his shoulders. Elliot wasn't touching either of us. His hands were in his pockets. Eyes already looking past the frame. I turned the picture face down. The air inside the branch smelled like paper and cold coffee. Sterile. Like no one laughed here. I stepped forward toward the marble counter. The young man behind it looked up with that customer service smile. Too wide, too polite. Good morning. How can I help you today? I'd like to speak with someone about Thomas Vasquez's accounts. I'm his wife. He blinked. Then tilted his head slightly. Do you have power of attorney on file? Not yet, but I believe there may be fraudulent use. He opened his mouth, then paused. One moment. Let me check. He typed. Behind me, someone coughed. The printer squealed. I glanced at the chairs nearby. Same Fox, leather seats, same magazines from 3 seasons ago. When Thomas and I opened our first joint account here in 1978, they served coffee in real mugs. Now it came from a pod machine, if at all. A woman emerged from the side hallway. Early 60s, thin-framed glasses, gray streak at her temple. Her eyes met mine and widened. Lenora? I squinted. Camila. She smiled gently. Come with me? Her office was tucked behind frosted glass. A fake plant stood wilting by the printer. She closed the door and gestured for me to sit. I heard about Thomas, she said quietly. I'm so sorry. Thank you. I'm trying to sort through things. She nodded. What do you need? I think Elliot has been using his accounts. While he's unconscious, while I'm not even on file anymore. Camilla's jaw tensed. He has POA, filed 3 years ago, valid unless revoked. And never told me, I remember. You left around that time. I looked down. Yes. But Thomas never wanted me erased. She studied me, then turned to her computer. I'm not supposed to show you this. But I think you have a right to know. Her fingers danced across the keys. The screen glowed. She turned it toward me. And I stopped breathing. March 8th, Forzen Desert Cove Spy. March 10th, Thunders and 800 flight to Palm Springs, first class. March 11th, 3600, Mariposa Wellness Retreat. March 13th, 2 to 50 luxury dining, wine pairing. March 14th or 12,000 jewelry boutique in La Jolla. Each entry pulsed like a bruise. These are all since the week Thomas was admitted. I whispered. Camila nodded slowly. He's been withdrawing under POA, she said. Technically, it's not illegal. But the pattern, the timing, it's disgusting. She didn't disagree. I sat back, throat dry. Has he paid the mortgage at least? Utilities, medical. She pulled up a second screen. Mortgage was delayed twice this quarter. Utility bill paid late last month. But this one is more important. She clicked. March 12th at 800 declined payment. Santa Barbara General Hospital. Not enough funds in checking. I stared. What was it for? She frowned. Authorization hold. Life-sustaining treatment. The room tilted. You mean? She nodded. A treatment was delayed. Because Elliot prioritized a wine dinner. I closed my eyes. My hand curled into a fist on my lap. Does the hospital know? Not unless they connect the dots. I stood slowly. Can I get a printed copy? She hesitated, then slid a manila folder toward me. This never happened. Of course. Back in the car, I opened the file again. The numbers blurred together. Luxury, retreat, jewelry, while Thomas faded breath by breath. While I sat alone in an airport terminal, praying I wasn't too late. A 800. That was the price of delay. That was how much dignity cost. and Elliot couldn't pay it. But he could buy a sapphire bracelet. I clenched the folder. He thought I wouldn't know. He thought I was done. But I was just getting started. The call rang 6 times before Elliot picked up. "Mom? This isn't a good time." His voice was impatient, clipped. I stayed calm. "I went to the bank. I know what you've been doing." Silence. Then, "You're not on the accounts?" "But I know what was declined. I know what you spent. Thomas was denied treatment for 800 while you—" "He was dying anyway. Don't start dramatizing." My breath caught. "You used your father's money for wine tastings and spas? It's mine to manage. He gave me power of attorney." "You left." "I left to survive, Elliot. I didn't leave him." "Look," he snapped, "you don't get to show up after years and suddenly play widow." "Widow." He said it like a joke. "You erased me, even from the photo wall?"
He made those choices.
"Did he? Or did you speak for him when he couldn't speak for himself?" He didn't answer. Then, colder, "We have it handled. Don't interfere." Click. The line went dead. I drove back to the house. No music. Just the hum of my thoughts, jittering like static. The yard was still tidy, but the porch felt colder than it had yesterday. Inside, the living room looked wrong. Same beige walls. Same lamp with the chipped base. But the family portraits were rearranged. Our wedding photo? Gone. I walked to the wall, fingers brushing the faint square of cleaner paint. The frame had hung there for 40 years, Thomas in his navy blues. Me in a handmade gown, gun, like I never belonged. In the kitchen, I sat at the round oak table. It still creaked when I leaned on it. I buried my face in my hands. Even the silence felt cruel. I had spent decades keeping this family together, and now I was a ghost in my own home. Footsteps creaked on the porch. Then a knock. I didn't move. The knock came again, softer. "Aunt Lenora, it's Lila." I blinked. "Lila." I opened the door. She stood with her jacket zipped to the chin, holding a small brown bag. "Hi." I brought lemon tea and cookies. "I didn't know if you had dinner." I stepped aside. She walked in, quiet as always. "I saw Elliot yesterday," she said, putting the bag on the counter. "He said you came back." "He didn't sound happy." "He isn't." She looked down. "He says a lot of things, Auntie. But I remember things too, like you reading to me when I had asthma and couldn't sleep." I stared at her. She smiled. "You always brought soft pretzels." I laughed, the sound surprising both of us. "I did, with cinnamon sugar." She poured the tea. We sat in silence for a moment. Then Lila said, "He made you disappear from the house. I noticed." I swallowed. "Do you think he loved your father?" She thought, "I think he loved control more." That pierced deeper than I expected. After tea, she helped me sort through papers, bills, hospital notes, legal documents I hadn't dared read yet. She worked quietly, no sighs, no impatience, just presence. At one point, she paused. "Do you want to fight him?" "Legally, I mean." I looked at her. She met my eyes without flinching. "Yes," I said finally. "But I don't know how." She reached into her bag and pulled out a blue folder. "Mom had me look into elder legal clinics at UCLA. There's a few here in the county. I printed some options." I stared at the folder, then at her, then reached across the table and held her hand. She didn't pull away. "Thank you, Lila. You matter. Aunt Lenora. Even if they act like you don't?" The words broke something loose inside me and planted something new. Hope. The invitation came in a thick ivory envelope. No return address. Just gold lettering across the front. An evening to honor Thomas J. Whitmore's legacy. Inside, a single card. Saturday at 6 p.m. The Cypress Room, Hillcrest Golf Club below in smaller print formal attire. RSVP to Elliot Whitmore. I turned it over, looking for anything that felt like warmth. There was none. I arrived 10 minutes early. The Hillcrest Club sat just outside the city, all brick arches and hedged pathways. The valet took my keys silently. Inside, the air was crisp with champagne and chilled cucumber water. I stepped into the main room. White tablecloths, hanging lights, dozens of chairs in neat circles around the stage, and silence when people saw me. A woman in a burgundy dress turned away. 2 men by the bar suddenly found their glasses interesting. I scanned the room for my seat. There, a single table near the corner. Label it. Reserved Lenora W. alone. Every other table had place cards grouped in 3s or 4s. Names I recognized: cousins, old coworkers, church friends, but no one seated near me. The slideshow began at 60:30 sharp. Elliot took the microphone. Tonight, we honor not just the man but the mission. My father gave us principles: sacrifice, vision, love. The screen lit up behind him. Thomas in uniform. Thomas building our treehouse. Thomas fishing with Elliot at Lake Tahoe. But never Thomas and me, not one photo. Not our wedding in 1973. Not our Thanksgiving meals. Not the hospital photos when he had his second surgery and I slept in the chair beside him. Gone, erased. The lights rose. Polite clapping filled the air. Now, Elliot said, beaming, we welcome guests to share their favorite memories of Dad. He gestured to the stage. People stood, each one polished, each story charming. He taught me how to tie a tie. Hay once drove across 2 states to bring me a science fair trophy. None mentioned the hospital. None mentioned the last 3 years of pain, of silence, of absence. I stayed seated. My tea had gone cold. At dessert, waitstaff placed crème brûlée before everyone except me. My table had been skipped. A passing server paused. Oh, this is table 13. Sorry. I think we were told it wasn't in use. He returned 10 minutes later, sheepish, with a plate that had clearly been taken from the kitchen leftovers. I ate it anyway. I was still hungry. Elliot stood again. His voice was smooth, carrying across the room like it had practiced. We also remember that legacy isn't just money, it's blood. It's those who carry the name and values forward. He paused. Then he looked at me. And sometimes it's not shared by everyone present. The room froze. My father believed in loyalty, in truth, and in protecting those who matter. Another beat. Some people are family by law, but not by love. My fork froze. The air vanished from the room. No one moved. Leela across the room stared at her glass. I saw her jaw tighten. I rose slowly, straightened my back and walked out. I didn't slam the door, didn't cry, didn't speak, just left. The parking lot was quiet. The car smelled like lemon air freshener, and the silence for the first time that week didn't hurt. It cleared. Like the last breath before a long dive. The next morning, I woke with salt in my throat and silence on my lips. My purse still held the invitation from the night before. A reminder that grief, when reshaped by cruelty, becomes something heavier than mourning. It becomes duty. I dressed in navy blue, conservative, crisp, the kind of outfit no one questioned. The elevator at Rothman and Wells creaked like old bones. A young receptionist with acrylic nails and a cheery voice greeted me. Do you have an appointment? Ma'am, I don't. But I'm here to see Mr. Denby. I was Thomas Whitmore's wife. Her smile faltered. He's with a client? I didn't budge. He'll want to see me. Please tell him it's Lenora? 10 minutes later, the glass door opened. Lenora, said a thin man in tortoise-rimmed glasses. I wasn't expecting you. His voice was polite, but his eyes narrowed. I could almost hear him calculating the risk. He gestured to a corner office, bookshelves, a brass lamp, a diploma from the University of Michigan. He offered coffee. I declined. Why are you here? I need to see Thomas's file. He stiffened. That's delicate. So was watching my husband die while our son erased me from a slideshow. He hesitated. I know there were updates. After his stroke, I want to see what changed. Another pause. Then he sighed, opened a drawer, pulled a thick folder and placed it on the desk between us. April 22, 2022. Last notarized adjustment, he said. His finger tapped the corner of the page. Elliot's name was everywhere. Power of attorney, executor, sole beneficiary of the estate. But another document sat beneath it, a letter, typed, dated March 4, 2021. It bore Thomas's signature. Neat. Decisive. Amendment to distribution plan. I read it twice. Then a third time, it was clear. Thomas had named Leela Ruth, their granddaughter, as the primary heir, due to ongoing concerns regarding Elliot's conduct and financial responsibility. I entrust Leela with what remains of my life's work. I looked up. Why wasn't this the final version? Denby cleared his throat. After the second stroke, Elliot insisted Thomas couldn't manage complex decisions. He brought in a medical letter, demanded reversion to the 2019 draft, but Thomas signed this one himself? I know. But no one challenged the guardianship. My fingers tightened on the page. Do you have the original copy of this letter? One scanned version, and that's what you're holding. I asked to take a photo. He hesitated, then nodded. But Lenora, be careful. Elliot's been aggressive lately. So have I. Outside, the wind bit through my sleeves. I walked 3 blocks before getting into a taxi. Home felt unfamiliar again, as if each key turned against me. But I had one lock left to test. In the hallway closet, behind the coats, was a panel Thomas had installed years ago. Hidden, flush with the wall, fingerprint locked. But there was a backup key, and I still had mine. The mechanism clicked. Inside it, a leather-bound ledger, a separate bank account, and a small, felt-lined box with a silver locket engraved LRW. The house was quiet, but my mind roared. I hadn't slept. Not even a blink. The air was cold despite the warmth of late spring. Or maybe it was me who had grown cold. Numb in a way that no blanket could thaw. I sat alone in the kitchen, the ceramic mug in my hand long cooled. Black tea. No sugar, no milk, just like Thomas drank it. Strong and unflinching, the cup trembled slightly as I held it, not from weakness but from the flood I was holding back. It was 2:47 a.m., the kind of hour where truth refuses to be ignored. I spread the contents of the leather file across the kitchen table. The photocopies, the locket, the alternate will, the deposit statements with dates that didn't match Elliot's versions of events. The subtle symbols Thomas had left behind. Breadcrumbs. Really? For a trail I wasn't meant to follow until now? And yet, here I was, following them in the dark. I touched the edge of the will with bare fingers, my name in his scrawl. Leela's initials in the beneficiary line. Dated 2 years after his stroke. So many had assumed Thomas was incapable of thought after that, but they were wrong. He may have lost his words, but not his intention. A noise creaked upstairs. The wind? Or the house remembering? I didn't move. I stayed seated, letting memories wash over me. Thomas used to leave the light on in the den when he worked late. I'd find him sometimes, eyes closed, pen still in hand, ledger open. When I'd scold him for falling asleep mid-balance sheet, he'd smile and say, "If I'm resting while the world spins, at least it's spinning in our favor." That night, I understood what he meant. Now, I was the one keeping watch, holding vigil not just for him, but for the pieces of him still scattered through this house. The smell of his cologne in the hallway, the leather creak of his chair, the tick of the Mantel clock we bought on our first anniversary, still keeping time without fail. I rose, paced the length of the kitchen, then returned to the table. I opened the small red notebook I'd found wedged behind the old recipes. Inside were rows of dates and expenses, detailed, meticulous, all in Thomas's hand, hidden deliberately. Dated after his stroke. He'd never shown them to me. Until now. There was one line that made me stop breathing. Emergency draft, if Lenora needs to protect what's ours. I read it 3 times. He had planned for this, he knew. At 4:15 a.m., I walked into the den and pulled a dusty photo album from the bookshelf. Flipping to the back, I found a faded photo Leela at the lake house, age 5, sitting on Thomas's lap as he read from an old hardback, her curls wild. His face soft and patient. He was pointing to a passage. I remembered the book, Robinson Crusoe, his favorite. I opened our copy and found the page dog-eared, with Thomas's writing in the margin, even alone. A man must chart his course with honor. I held the photo close to my chest and whispered, "I'll chart mine, Thomas." By sunrise, I had written and rewritten the same letter 4 times. The 5th version stayed. "Dear Leela, if this letter reaches you, then something in our lives has shifted. You always asked why Grandpa kept old books, why he saved receipts, why he never trusted email. And now you know, he wasn't paranoid, he was prepared. Because love doesn't just protect in presence. It protects in absence too. I know you felt cast aside, but he never set you down. He just didn't know how to say it in the end. His words left him, but not his will. I'm going to show you everything. The real documents. The truth behind what was taken from you, and from me. But I want you to know this first. He loved you more than any policy or account could ever hold. He believed you would rise. And so do I. Love always, Grandma." I sealed the envelope and placed it in the safe under the stairs, next to the documents, labeled clearly, "For Leela." When ready, then I walked to the kitchen window. The The sky had shifted from blue-black to pale apricot, the quiet kind of morning, the kind Thomas loved. Dew glistened on the rose bushes. A single robin pecked at the grass. But my heart thumped. I reached for my old address book, flipped through the alphabetized tabs until I landed on D. Dolliman James, retired CPA, trusted by Thomas for decades. Discreet, honest, loyal to the last decimal. I dialed. It rang twice. Then, Dolliman, or Mr. Dolman, it's Lenora Whitmore. A pause. Sharp inhale. Lenora. Good heavens. It's been ages. I know. I'm sorry to call so early. Don't apologize. What's going on? I need your help. Off the record. I found some documents. From Thomas. Silence stretched. Then his voice dropped. If this is about Elliot, you're not the first person to question him. I closed my eyes. The house was still again. But inside me, something had stirred awake. James Dolliman's home office smelled like old pine and honesty. Stacks of folders lined his walls, and a sleepy golden retriever named Rosie watched me from a patch of sun by the window. I sat across from the man who had once guarded Thomas's financial legacy as if it were his own. James poured coffee into chipped mugs. It's been a while since I handled anything this serious, he said. It's time, I replied. He slid the folder I'd given him closer, flipping through its contents with slow, deliberate hands. The will, the transfer slips, the account summaries. Thomas was always meticulous. I remember he once made me reprint a quarterly report because a comma was missing. I smiled faintly. He was that way with everything except people. James looked up. Except Elliot. Silence stretched between us. I broke it. Can you trace any unauthorized movements? He nodded. I can try. If Elliot funneled anything, I'll find it. For the next 2 hours, we worked side by side. James scanned documents into a secure drive while I organized physical copies by category pre-stroke, post-stroke disputed items. I highlighted dates that overlapped suspicious transactions, especially those involving the Setterwood property. James frowned. Setterwood was part of the Whitmore Trust. It shouldn't have moved without both your signatures. It did. And now it's in Elliot's name. His wife's. Technically. James shook his head. Slick. Illegal? That's for your lawyer to say. But I'll package this cleanly. Back home. I sat at Thomas's old roll-top desk and drafted a list of contacts. I called Marlena, a notary who had witnessed many of our documents over the years. She remembered the signature day in question. No, dear, you weren't there. Just Thomas and Elliot. I assumed you'd signed earlier. I hung up slowly. My stomach turned. Forged. The word stuck like a bone. Next came the bank. I requested an itemized history of every account linked to Thomas's estate. The clerk hesitated, but when I gave her the notarized durable puet, the original, her tone changed. I'll escalate this to compliance, she said. We'll respond within 48 hours. In the meantime, I cleaned the study, dusting Thomas's framed diplomas. Wiping the fingerprints off his clock, I found peace in it. The rhythm of cloth on wood, of setting order where things had been disturbed. Midway through sorting the lower cabinet, I found something wedged behind old accounting manuals, a cassette tape. Labeled J. Halberd, March 2021. I stared at it. Halberd. That had been Thomas's assistant before his stroke. I didn't own a cassette player. But James might. I drove back that evening. The sun dipped low over the hills as I knocked on his door, tape in hand. James met me with a puzzled brow. Twice in one day? You must miss me. I held up the tape. He blinked. That's from the old answering machine model we used. Come in. He rummaged through a drawer and pulled out a dusty player. The tape hissed. Then, this is Halberd, March 12. Thomas, if you're listening, Elliot approached me today. Asked if I'd help him tidy up some account entries. I refused, obviously, but I wanted you to know. He's planning something. Don't let your guard down. James and I sat in silence. Thomas kept this, I said, my voice thin. Even after? And now you have it? That night, I scanned and uploaded everything: the forged signature, the voice message, the property shift records. The drive was encrypted and sent to Armando Ruiz, a lawyer recommended by James, ethical, discreet, sharp. Within minutes, my phone buzzed. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, This isn't just a quiet dispute. This is a pattern. I can help. I exhaled. For the first time in weeks, I slept. The courthouse smelled of wood polish and cool marble. I stood outside room 302, clutching the folder tighter than I needed to. Inside were the pages that held my husband's dignity and my son's deceit. Armando Ruiz, calm and composed in his charcoal gray suit, nodded at me. "We're ready?" I nodded back. As the heavy door swung open, every eye in the gallery turned toward us. Elliot was already seated at the defense table. He didn't stand. Just offered a tight smile I didn't return. The judge, a woman in her 50s with stern eyes and silver, streaked hair, called the case. Petitioner, Lenora Whitmore. Respondent Elliot Whitmore. Matter estate misuse and fraudulent transfer. Elliot's lawyer rose, his tone holy. Your Honor, this is nothing more than a grieving widow struggling with closure. The estate transfers were lawful and... Armando rose slowly. Respectfully, Your Honor, this is not about grief. It's about deception. He opened the folder. Calm, unfolding the truth one sheet at a time. The petitioner presents evidence of forged signatures, documented by a licensed notary, on estate transfer forms. A voice recording from Mr. Halberd, Thomas Whitmore's assistant, warning of Elliot's attempts to conceal fund movements. A paper trail showing the Setterwood property, originally protected under marital trust, shifted illegally. And this. He held up a flash drive. A full itemized report conducted by CPA James Dolleman showing withdrawals, redirections, and shell accounts tied to Elliot's family. The judge gestured for the evidence. Elliot shifted in his seat. I'd like to call Lenora Whitmore to the stand. My heart pounded, but I stood. Sworn in, I sat down under the courtroom lights. I thought they'd feel hot, but it was the silence that made me sweat. Armando asked simply, "What did Thomas mean to you?" I blinked. Then answered, "He was my compass, and when he began fading, I promised to protect what he left behind." Did you authorize any property transfers after Thomas's stroke? No. Did Thomas? Not knowingly. Did he leave behind any final words? I pulled the envelope from my purse. I found this in our safe, dated 1 week before his last hospitalization. It's addressed to me, but meant for both of us? The judge allowed it to be read into the record. Armando opened the seal. His voice steadied. To Lenora and in case needed, Elliot, if you are reading this, then something has happened that I feared. I have long suspected manipulation surrounding the estate. Lenora, if you're holding this, trust your instinct. Trust Dolleman. Trust the records. Elliot, if you are hearing this in court, then I am disappointed. I raised you to be better than a thief with a law degree. Lenora, the legacy is yours. The trust is structured to protect the person I trusted most, and that has always been you. T. Whitmore. I looked up. Elliot's eyes were wide. His lawyer whispered something sharp. The courtroom held its breath. The judge took a long pause. I've heard enough. She turned to Elliot. Mr. Whitmore, based on the evidence, your financial misconduct, the forged documents, and your father's written and recorded concerns, I am freezing all assets transferred under your authority. The marital trust will revert to Mrs. Whitmore's full control, effective immediately. Elliot leapt to his feet. You can't! He was senile! This is manipulation! The bailiff moved toward him. The judge's voice never wavered. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. He sat. Hard. Furthermore, she continued, the court will recommend this case for criminal investigation regarding estate fraud. The gavel fell like thunder. Court adjourned. Outside, the afternoon sun felt sharper. Armando offered me the folder back. I shook my head. Keep it. In case he tries again, he nodded. I started toward the parking lot. Elliot stood by the steps, red-faced and breathing fast. You were never supposed to win, he hissed. I looked at him. No, Elliot. You were never supposed to lose yourself. The courthouse smelled like old polish and cautious hope. I stood in the hallway, folder pressed tight against my chest. My heels clicked once on the marble before I stopped. Armando stood beside me, calm as a stone, his suit pressed, his tie a quiet navy. You ready, Lenora? I wasn't, but I nodded. Courtroom 302 wasn't big, but it felt like a stadium. Eyes turned when we entered, not pitying, not warm, Just watching. Elliot sat at the far table. Dark suit. No smile. He didn't glance my way. He already thought he'd won. The bailiff called the room to order. The judge entered. Mid-50s. Stern jaw. A small gold pin on her robe. Petitioner Lenora Whitmore. Respondent Elliot Whitmore. Case alleged fraudulent transfer of estate assets. Breach of fiduciary duty. Elliot's lawyer rose first. Polish, confident? Too smooth. Your Honor, what we have is a grieving widow confused by estate complexities. My client as legal son and power of attorney. Armando stood slowly, clearing his throat. No. What we have is a man who siphoned from his dying father and thought no one would notice. He opened the folder like it was sacred. Your Honor, we submit notarized documents showing forged signatures, voice memos from Thomas Whitmore's longtime assistant warning of concealed transactions, forensic audit by retired CPA James Dolman, tracing account diversions to shell corporations tied to Elliot Whitmore's in-laws, transfer of Setterwood property, against marital trust provisions, a sealed letter from Thomas Whitmore discovered in the family safe. The judge took each piece like a weight added to a scale. Call your first witness, she said. Armando turned to me. Mrs. Whitmore. I stood, hands cold. My knees were steady only because I'd practiced this moment every night since the discovery. Sworn in. Seated. Lights above humming low. Lenora? How long were you married to Thomas? 43 years? What did he value most? Honor? Clarity? Family legacy? Did he ever give Elliot sole control over your marital trust? No. Did he indicate concern in the final months? Yes. He wrote this. I pulled the envelope from my purse. Armando opened it gently. No flourish. Just reverence. To Lenora, and if necessary, to Elliot. If this is being read aloud, then the silence has been broken. Lenora, if you've discovered wrongdoing, trust your instinct. You've always seen clearly. Elliot, if you're hearing this in court, then you've crossed a line I prayed you'd never find. You were born into legacy, not to steal it. I've prepared measures. Lenora knows who to call. The trust belongs to the one I trusted most, and that has always been your mother, T. Whitmore. Silence. The kind that leaves no room for spin. Elliot's face paled. He looked away. His lawyer's hands fidgeted. The judge didn't blink. I've heard enough, she said. She turned to Elliot. Mr. Whitmore, the evidence is clear. This court finds probable cause for financial misconduct. We hereby freeze all estate accounts and revert full control of the marital trust to Mrs. Lenora Whitmore, effective immediately. Elliot shot up. He was senile. You're letting emotion.
Sit. Down. The gavel cracked once.
Furthermore, this court recommends the case for criminal investigation. He stared at me, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. You were never supposed to win, he hissed, outside on the courthouse steps. I looked at him, not the lawyer, not the betrayer, just the boy I once rocked to sleep. You were never supposed to forget who you were. He turned away. No words. Armando walked me to my car. You did good, he said. I did what needed to be done. The folder was lighter now. Or maybe I was. Back home? I placed the court documents inside the fireproof box, beside the photo of Thomas in his army uniform. His eyes still calm. Still sure. I sat down in the kitchen, where the light pooled just the way he liked. No applause, no celebration. Just the clean stillness of justice done. And somewhere in that silence, I finally breathed. The morning after the verdict, the house was silent. Not heavy like before, just still. I moved through the kitchen slowly, letting the sunlight stretch across the countertop, the same way it did on slow Sundays when Thomas was alive. The mug I used for years, his old military insignia still faint on the side, rested warm in my hands. The dishwasher hummed. Outside, cardinals flitted between the trees. Life continued. I'd half expected to find Elliot on the porch, arms crossed, a speech prepared. But there was only a folded envelope slipped under the front door. Lenora, I'm leaving. I know what I did. I don't know why I did it. Maybe someday I'll understand. Or maybe I won't. Just know, I never hated you. I just wanted to win. That's all I ever saw Dad do. Win, no apology, just explanation. I set the note down on the hallway table. My hands didn't shake, not anymore. The backyard had overgrown in the months of distraction, weeds choking the roses Thomas planted for our 25th anniversary. I knelt, gloved hands pulling at stubborn roots. Each tug felt like reclaiming something. Every corner of this yard held a memory. Lila's 3rd birthday, Thomas flipping pancakes in the open air, Elliot once building a fort beneath the old oak. Not every memory had to hurt. By noon, the soil beneath my nails felt like closure. Emily arrived unannounced. She didn't knock. Just walked through the back gate holding a small plant in a clay pot. "I thought the garden could use something new," she said. Her eyes were puffy, but calm. I wiped my hands on my jeans and nodded. "Marigolds," she grinned. "Thomas used to say they were too loud. I think he'd like them now." We planted them near the steps, her fingers beside mine in the dirt. No need to speak about Elliot. We understood the silence better than any words. After we cleaned up, she lingered in the kitchen.
Grandma.
"I want to stay. I don't want to go back to Mom."
Not yet?
She wasn't asking. She was declaring something. I reached for the tin of tea Thomas used to keep tucked behind the flower. "I'd like that," I said. She exhaled, her shoulders finally lowering. That evening, a call came. "Mrs. Whitmore?" The woman's voice on the other end said gently. "This is Director Franklin from Hilltop Center. We've received notice of your case and the outcome. We were wondering if you'd consider setting up a memorial scholarship in Mr. Whitmore's name for veterans' grandchildren in financial need." I didn't answer right away. I looked toward the study, where Thomas, typewriter, still sat, the same desk where he drafted letters to military families, where he jotted notes for town hall speeches no one asked for. But he gave anyway. "Yes," I said. That's exactly what he would have wanted. And maybe, for the first time in too long, what I wanted too. Later, I opened the safe one final time. Inside, the sealed deed to the house, my wedding band in its velvet box, and a photo of Thomas and I at Coney Island. Before kids, before careers. Just us? I closed the safe. The locks clicked into place, and I left it alone. The sun rose slowly that morning, no longer a burden, but an invitation. Emily stirred beside the windowsill, curled up with a book from Thomas's old shelf, the one with the frayed spine and gold title faded to silver. I watched her for a moment, the way she traced the pages with reverence, not rushing. Just present. Outside, the marigolds bloomed wildly. The scholarship fund in Thomas's name launched quietly. No ribbon, cutting ceremony, just a letter to the local paper and a simple website built by Emily's classmate. Applications began to trickle in: sons of nurses, daughters of disabled veterans, a young girl who wrote about her grandfather's medals, wrapped in tissue paper. Each letter reminded me that healing isn't an end. It's a continuation. We framed the first thank you note and placed it near the fireplace. Next to it sat the photo of Thomas holding Emily when she was 2. Both of them laughing at something only they understood. I let the house breathe. We opened the windows, repainted the shutters, and turned the front room into a space for writing, planting, and soft music. Evenings became moments again, not hours to survive, but hours to live. I'd sometimes find Emily standing in the garden, barefoot, her arms crossed, lips moving like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. She told me once she spoke to Thomas, told him about school, about the boy who sat next to her in chemistry, about how she forgave Elliot but didn't forget. I said nothing. Just held her after. The last thing I did was pack away the military shadow box, the medals, the photos, the letter Thomas wrote to me from his first tour. I didn't hide it. I placed it in a cedar chest by the front door. Legacy doesn't need to be on display to be known. One night, as we stirred soup together in the quiet kitchen, Emily looked up and asked, "Do you miss him every day?"
I didn't lie.
Yes. But it's softer now, like the smell of his cologne when the windows are open. Not sharp. Just there. She smiled. I think he'd be proud. We sat under the porch later that night, the stars as loud as silence can be. I held her hand. Strong, steady, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like someone grieving. I felt like someone becoming. Share your story below. What would you do if your legacy was nearly erased? Your voice might help someone feel less alone. Because healing doesn't whisper. It echoes. And we're still listening.